December 19th, 2023, 11:47 p.m., Whitefish, Montana.
The thermometer outside the cabin window read -18 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside the Morrison family's single-room home, it felt even colder. Emma Morrison, 12 years old and too thin for her age, pressed her face against the frosted glass and watched the snow fall in thick, relentless sheets. Her stomach cramped with hunger so sharp it felt like something was eating her from the inside out. Behind her, curled together under every blanket they owned, her mother Sarah and 5-year-old brother Danny slept fitfully. Across the room, Grandpa Thomas sat in his rocking chair, staring into the dying embers of their wood stove. They'd burned the last of their firewood 2 days ago. Tomorrow, they'd have to start breaking apart furniture. The rabbit appeared at exactly midnight. Emma saw it first, a dark shape against the white snow, placed carefully on their doorstep like an offering. Her breath caught. She rubbed her eyes, certain she was hallucinating from hunger. But when she looked again, it was still there, fresh, recently killed, still warm enough that steam rose from its body in the freezing air. "Grandpa," she whispered, not wanting to wake her mother, "there's something outside." Thomas pushed himself up with the groan of a 74-year-old man whose body had worked too hard for too many years. He limped to the window, his bad knee clicking with each step, and stared at the rabbit for a long moment. Something flickered across his weathered face, emotion Emma couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "Stay inside," he said quietly, then grabbed his coat and stepped into the blizzard. Emma watched through the window as her grandfather bent down, picked up the rabbit, and examined it carefully. His hands trembled, but not from the cold. He looked out into the darkness beyond their small circle of porch light, scanning the tree line 200 yards away. Then he did something that made Emma's blood run cold. He spoke to the darkness. "I know it's you," Thomas said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "After all these years, I know." Nothing answered. No movement in the trees, just snow and wind and the vast emptiness of Montana wilderness in the dead of winter. But Emma saw it, a flash of white, too large to be snow, too deliberate to be wind-blown. Something massive, moving between the pines with the silence of a ghost. Then it was gone. Thomas came back inside, the rabbit clutched in his hands, and met Emma's eyes with an expression that was half grief, half wonder. "Don't tell your mother," he said. "Not yet." Before we dive deeper into this impossible mystery, if stories about loyalty that transcends generations move you, hit that subscribe button now. Every subscription helps us share more of these incredible true tales. Drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. Now, back to the story. The Morrison family's nightmare had started 8 months earlier, when Sarah's husband Jack died in a logging
accident near Hungry Horse Reservoir.
The company ruled it an accident. OSHA disagreed, but had no power to do anything about it. Jack's life insurance policy had lapsed 2 months before his death, a detail the family discovered too late. One moment, they'd been a normal working-class family, barely scraping by but managing. The next moment, they were drowning. Sarah worked 3 jobs, but it wasn't enough. Morning shift at the diner in Whitefish, afternoon cleaning rooms at the Mountain Pine Lodge, evenings stocking shelves at Albertsons. 70 hours a week, and they still couldn't make rent. In September, they'd been evicted from their trailer. In October, they'd moved into Thomas's cabin, 15 miles outside town, on land that had been in the family for 3 generations. The cabin was supposed to be temporary. It wasn't winterized. No insulation, gaps in the walls where wind whistled through, a wood stove that barely heated the single room. But it was free, and that made it their only option. Winter in Montana is not forgiving to the unprepared. By November, they'd burned through their savings, keeping Danny's asthma medication stocked. By early December, they were eating 1 meal a day, carefully rationed from the food bank. Emma had lost 15 pounds. Danny's ribs were visible through his shirt. Sarah's hands shook constantly from malnutrition and exhaustion. 3 days ago, the food had run out completely. They'd been staring at the prospect of actual starvation when the first rabbit appeared. Then another the next night, and another. Always at midnight, always placed carefully on their doorstep, always fresh and recently killed. Someone, or something, was keeping them alive. Now Emma watched as her grandfather skinned and cleaned the rabbit with practiced hands, his movements automatic despite the trembling. He was a former Forest Service ranger, retired 20 years, and he knew how to survive in the wilderness. But he'd never been a hunter. He'd spent his career protecting animals, not killing them. "Where do you think it's coming from?" Emma asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He hung the rabbit meat over their makeshift drying rack, portions for tomorrow's stew. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, lost in memory. 50 years ago, I made a choice, he said. I thought I'd forgotten about it. Guess some debts don't expire. What choice? Later. Thomas limped back to his chair. Get some sleep, Em. Morning's coming whether we're ready or not. But Emma didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the tree line, and saw the white shape return. It moved like smoke, barely visible against the snow, circling their property in a wide arc. Massive, powerful, deliberate. A wolf. Not the grey wolves that occasionally wandered through Montana from Yellowstone. This was something different. Larger. Its fur so white it seemed to glow in the darkness. An alpha, Emma thought, remembering nature documentaries she'd
Watched in better times. A leader.
It paused at the edge of the tree line, and for just a moment, Emma could have sworn it was looking directly at her. Its eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting amber gold. Intelligent, ancient, knowing. Then it was gone. Morning came grey and bitter. Sarah woke, saw the rabbit meat, and immediately tensed. Where did this come from? She demanded. Someone left it, Thomas said calmly. Don't know who, don't much care. We needed food, now we have it. Dad, we can't accept charity from... We're not accepting charity, Thomas interrupted, his voice harder than Emma had ever heard it. We're accepting a gift. There's a difference. Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but was too hungry and too tired to fight. She nodded and started preparing the meat for breakfast. The smell of cooking rabbit filled the tiny cabin, and Emma's stomach cramped so violently she gasped. They ate in silence, savoring every bite, rationing carefully so the meat would last. Danny, 5 years old and too young to understand why they'd been so hungry, simply ate with the singular focus of a child who'd forgotten what full felt like. After breakfast, Sarah left for her first shift. Thomas retreated to his chair. Danny played with sticks on the floor, building imaginary castles, and Emma returned to the window, watching. The snow had stopped. The sun broke through clouds, turning the landscape into a blinding field of white. And there, clear as day in the fresh snow, were the tracks. Wolf tracks. Massive paw prints, at least 5 inches across, leading from the tree line to their doorstep and back again. A single set of tracks, no pack, just one enormous animal that had walked right up to their cabin and left them food. Emma grabbed her coat. Where are you going? Thomas asked sharply. I want to see where it came from. No. Grandpa. I said no. Thomas stood, wincing as his bad knee protested. You don't follow wolves, Emma. Not these woods. Not that wolf. Why not? Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring at the tracks through the window. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that made Emma shiver. Because some debts are dangerous to collect.
But Emma Morrison had inherited her grandfather's stubbornness, along with his green eyes.
That afternoon, while Thomas dozed and Danny napped, she slipped outside. The tracks were easy to follow. They led straight into the forest, disappearing into the dense pine and Douglas fir that stretched for miles. Emma walked carefully, staying in the wolf's prints to avoid breaking through the deep snow. The temperature was maybe 10 degrees, the air so cold it burned her lungs with each breath. Half a mile in, she found the first kill site. Rabbit blood stained the snow, spray patterns indicating a quick, efficient kill. The wolf had eaten nothing, simply killed the rabbit and carried it to the cabin. Nearby, Emma saw more tracks. The wolf had been here multiple times, hunting specifically for them. She kept walking. The forest grew denser, shadows lengthening as the afternoon sun began its early winter descent. Emma knew she should turn back, knew her grandfather would be furious. But something pulled her forward, a need to understand why this animal was helping them. Another quarter-mile, and the tracks led to a small clearing. Emma stopped at the edge, her breath catching. In the center of the clearing stood the white wolf. It was even larger than she'd imagined, easily over 100 pounds of pure muscle and winter coat. Its fur was pristine white, unmarked except for a distinctive scar across its right shoulder. It sat on its haunches like a statue, watching her with those same amber eyes she'd seen the night before. Emma knew she should run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to back away slowly, avoid eye contact, make herself small. Instead, she stood frozen, locked in that ancient stare. The wolf didn't move, didn't growl, didn't show teeth. It simply watched her, and in that watching, Emma felt something impossible: recognition. Not of her specifically, but of her family, her bloodline. As if the wolf could see through her to Thomas, and through Thomas to something even further back in time. "Why are you helping us?" Emma whispered. The wolf's ears twitched. Then, with movements that seemed almost deliberate, it stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. It paused, looked back at her once, and disappeared into the trees. Emma stood alone in the clearing for a long time, heart pounding, mind racing. Then she turned and ran back to the cabin, following her own tracks in the snow. Thomas was waiting on the porch, his face carved from stone. "You followed it," he said, not a question. "I had to know." "You had to know nothing." Thomas grabbed her shoulders, not rough but firm. "Listen to me, Emma. That wolf is dangerous, not because it wants to hurt us, but because of what it represents. You stay away from it. You hear me?" "But it's helping us." "And that's exactly the problem." Thomas released her, his hands shaking. "Some gifts come with prices we can't afford to pay." That night, another rabbit appeared at midnight. This time, Emma saw the wolf clearly. It approached from the tree line, moving with the confidence of an animal that feared nothing. In its jaws, gently held, was a freshly killed rabbit. It placed it carefully on the doorstep, then sat back on its haunches and looked directly at the window where Emma watched. For 10 seconds, they stared at each other. Girl and wolf, separated by glass and 100 generations of evolution, connected by something neither could name. Then the wolf turned and vanished into the darkness. Emma looked at her grandfather. Thomas stood beside her, tears running down his weathered cheeks, reflecting silver in the moonlight. "Tell me," Emma said quietly. "Tell me what happened 50 years ago." Thomas was silent for so long, Emma thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with the weight of 5 decades pressing on his voice, he began. "It was February 1974, he said. "I was 24 years old, brand new Forest Service ranger, stationed right here in Whitefish. Thought I knew everything about these mountains, thought I was invincible." He moved to his chair, lowering himself down with a grimace. Back then, wolves were nearly extinct in Montana. The government had spent decades poisoning them, shooting them, wiping them out to protect livestock. But there were rumors of a pack that had survived. White wolves, people called them. Ghosts of the forest. Most rangers thought it was folklore. "But it wasn't," Emma said. "No, it wasn't." Thomas stared into the dead embers of the wood stove. "I was doing a winter patrol, up in the high country near Glacier. Found a trap line that shouldn't have been there. Illegal steel leg holds, the kind that shatter bone. And in one of them, I found him." "The wolf?" Thomas nodded. "Not this wolf. His grandfather, maybe, or great-grandfather. I don't know how many generations it's been, but the same white fur, the same eyes. He'd been trapped for at least a day, maybe 2. The trap had crushed his leg so badly I could see bone. He should have been dead from shock and cold. Emma sat on the floor at her grandfather's feet, listening with the intensity of someone hearing a creation myth. "He didn't fight me," Thomas continued. "That's what I remember most. When I approached, he just watched me, like he knew I was his last chance. I spent 2 hours freeing him from that trap. Used my emergency kit to stabilize the leg, splintered it with branches. I should have called it in, should have followed protocol. But something in those eyes. You let him go. I carried him 2 miles to a cave I knew, one that would shelter him from the wind. Left him my emergency rations. Visited every day for 3 weeks until the leg healed enough for him to walk. Then I watched him disappear into the wilderness, and I never told anyone what I'd done." Thomas looked at Emma, his eyes red. "Saving that wolf violated every regulation in my handbook. If my superiors had found out, I would have lost my job. The wolf was endangered."
Sure, but saving one animal wasn't worth my career. That's what I told myself. But the truth is, I couldn't leave him there. Something about the way he looked at me made me understand that this wasn't just an animal. This was something older, something that mattered. "And now his descendant is feeding us," Emma said softly. "Wolves remember," Thomas whispered. "People don't want to believe it, but they do. They remember kindness. They remember debt. And they pass those memories down through generations, through pack bonds that we can't begin to understand. So for 50 years, I forgot about it. Got married, raised your mother, retired, lost your grandmother. Life went on, and I assumed the wolves had forgotten too." Thomas wiped his eyes. "But wolves don't forget. And now we're starving in the same mountains where I saved his ancestor, and he's returning the favor." Emma looked out the window at the darkness beyond. "What happens when we're not starving anymore? What happens when winter ends?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I don't know if this is a debt being paid or a bond being formed. I don't know if he'll disappear when we don't need him anymore, or if he'll keep coming back. And that's what scares me." "Why does it scare you?" Thomas met her eyes. "Because bonds go both ways, Emma. He's helping us now. But what happens when he needs help? What happens when that debt comes due?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, snow began to fall again, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of presence. "I am here. I remember. I keep my promises." The rabbits kept coming. Every night at midnight, like clockwork, the white wolf appeared. Sometimes Emma watched from the window. Sometimes Thomas did. Twice, Sarah caught glimpses of the massive animal, though she never got a clear view. Danny, mercifully, slept through it all, dreaming whatever dreams 5-year-olds have when their stomachs are finally full.
By Christmas Eve, 12 rabbits had appeared. 12 meals that stood between the Morrison family and genuine starvation. Sarah had stopped asking questions. Hunger has a way of making people pragmatic about miracles. The temperature dropped to -28 degrees on December 23rd. The cabin's gaps leaked cold like water through a sieve, and their wood stove glowed red, trying to keep the single room above freezing. Danny's breath came in whistles, his asthma triggered by the bitter air. Sarah wrapped him in every blanket they owned and held him through the night, her own body shaking with cold and exhaustion. Emma couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching for the white shape she knew would come. Midnight approached, then passed. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. No wolf. By 3 in the morning, Emma's stomach had twisted itself into knots of anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger. Something was wrong. She could feel it the same way animals sense earthquakes before they hit. "He's not coming," she whispered. Thomas, who hadn't slept either, nodded slowly. "No, he's not." "Why?" "Don't know. But wolves don't break patterns without reason." Emma made a decision. She stood, started pulling on layers of clothing. "What are you doing?" Thomas demanded. "Something's wrong. I need to find him." Absolutely not. It's -30 out there, Emma. You'll be dead in an hour. Then come with me. Emma met her grandfather's eyes. You know I'm right. You feel it too. Thomas wanted to argue. Emma could see the refusal forming on his lips. But then he looked at the empty doorstep, at the tracks that had become as familiar as a friend's footsteps, and something in his expression crumbled. Your mother will kill me, he muttered, reaching for his coat. They left a note for Sarah, grabbed flashlights, and stepped into the kind of cold that stops time. The snow crunched under their boots with sounds like breaking bones. Emma's lungs burned with the first breath of frozen air. The wolf's tracks were easy to follow, deeper than usual, staggering in places. Thomas noticed it immediately. He's injured, he said quietly. See how the right front paw is dragging? Something's wrong with that leg. They walked for 20 minutes, Emma supporting Thomas when his bad knee threatened to give out, Thomas guiding them when the tracks became hard to read. The forest pressed close around them, silent except for their labored breathing and the distant crack of trees splitting from cold. The tracks led to a ravine Emma had never seen before. They stood at the edge, shining their flashlights down into darkness. 30 feet below, caught between two fallen logs, the white wolf lay motionless. Blood stained the snow around him, black in the flashlight beam. Oh God, Emma breathed. The wolf's head lifted slightly at the sound of her voice. Those amber eyes found hers, and Emma saw something that broke her heart. Not fear, not even pain, just resignation. The wolf had
Fallen, was dying and knew it. We have to get down there, Emma said. Emma, that's a 30-foot drop on ice. I don't care. Emma was already looking for a way down, testing handholds on exposed roots. He saved our lives. All of us. I'm not leaving him to die alone. Thomas grabbed her arm. Listen to me. Even injured, a wolf that size could kill you in seconds if you go down there and he feels threatened. He won't. Emma shook off her grandfather's hand. I know he won't. She found a route, a series of rock outcroppings and frozen earth steps that looked terrifying but possible. Thomas tried to stop her once more, then gave up and focused on guiding her from above, shining his flashlight to illuminate the path. Emma climbed down slowly, testing each foothold before committing her weight. Twice she slipped, catching herself on exposed roots that dug into her palms through her gloves. The cold bit at her exposed face, ice crystals forming on her eyelashes. She reached the bottom and approached the wolf carefully. Up close, he was even more massive than she'd realized. His shoulder was easily at her chest height. The white fur was matted with blood from a deep gash across his right foreleg, the same leg Thomas's wolf had injured 50 years ago. The parallel was not lost on Emma. Hey, she whispered, kneeling in the snow a few feet away. I'm here to help, just like my grandpa helped your grandfather. The wolf watched her but didn't move. His breathing was shallow, labored. Emma could see his ribcage moving with each painful breath. She inched closer. The wolf's eyes tracked her movement, but he showed no aggression. When she was close enough to touch him, Emma slowly reached out her hand. I won't hurt you, she promised. Her fingers made contact with his fur. It was softer than she'd imagined, thick and warm despite the cold. The wolf's eyes closed briefly, then opened again. Emma took that as permission. She examined the wound carefully. It wasn't from a fall. This was a cut, clean and deep, made by something sharp. Metal, Emma thought. A trap, maybe, or barbed wire. The wolf had torn himself free, reopening the wound in the process, then fallen into the ravine while weakened from blood loss. Thomas, Emma called up. He's hurt bad. Some kind of cut, maybe infected. I need the first aid kit. Emma, we can't. Now, Grandpa! Thomas disappeared from view. Emma heard his truck start in the distance, drive closer. 10 minutes later, he returned with their emergency medical supplies, the same kit he'd carried as a Forest Service ranger 40 years ago. I'm lowering it down, Thomas called, tied to a rope. The kit descended slowly, swaying in the slight breeze. Emma caught it and opened it with numb fingers. Antiseptic, gauze, Pressure bandages. Not much, but maybe enough. She looked at the wolf. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry. The wolf didn't react as Emma cleaned the wound, didn't flinch when she poured antiseptic over torn flesh, didn't slap when she wrapped the leg in layers of gauze and secured it with medical tape. He simply lay there, trusting her with a faith that seemed impossible for a wild animal. "Good boy," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "You're so brave." When she finished, she sat back and assessed the situation. The wolf was too heavy for her to lift. Even with Thomas's help, getting him up the ravine wall was impossible. But leaving him here to freeze was not an option. Emma took off her coat and draped it over the wolf's body. Then she sat down next to him, pressing her body against his for warmth. "What are you doing?" Thomas called down, alarm in his voice. "Keeping him warm," Emma called back. "Go home. Make sure Mom and Danny are okay. I'll stay here until sunrise, then we'll figure something out." "Emma Morrison, you will not." "Go home, Grandpa. That's an order." Thomas argued for another 5 minutes, but Emma was immovable. Finally, with the reluctance of someone leaving half their heart behind, he left. Emma sat in the darkness, her back against the wolf's side, feeling his heartbeat through his fur. Slow, steady, strong enough to keep fighting. "You don't give up, do you?" she said softly. "Just like us. Just like our whole stubborn family." The wolf's breathing evened out slightly, as if her presence brought comfort. Emma talked to him through the night, telling him about her father, about the logging accident that had taken him, about the slow collapse of everything they'd built. She told him about her mother's 3 jobs, about Danny's asthma, about nights when they'd gone to bed so hungry that sleep was impossible. "You saved us," she said. "When everyone else gave up, when the government said they couldn't help, when the community pretended not to see us falling apart, you saved us. You didn't have to. Nobody would have blamed you for letting us starve. But you remembered. You remembered what we did for your family 50 years ago, and you paid it back." The wolf's eyes opened. In the darkness, they glowed faint amber. "So I'm not leaving you," Emma continued. "I don't care how cold it gets. I don't care if I freeze down here. You're not dying alone." Dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through the trees above. Emma had stopped shivering an hour ago, which she knew was a bad sign. Hypothermia's later stages involved warmth, drowsiness, the gentle slide into death that felt like falling asleep. She fought to keep her eyes open. The sound of engines pulled her back from the edge. Multiple vehicles moving fast. Emma heard her mother's voice, sharp with panic, and Thomas's voice trying to calm her. Then other voices, men she didn't recognize. "Down there," Thomas was saying. "My granddaughter. She's been down there all night with—" "Jesus Christ, is that a wolf?" A new voice, harsh and unfamiliar. "Tom, that's a goddamn wolf. Your granddaughter is sitting with a wolf." "He's injured," Thomas said firmly. "He's not a threat." "The hell he isn't. That thing is huge. Could be rabid." Emma forced her head up. Through the grey dawn light, she saw shapes at the top of the ravine. Her mother, Thomas, and 3 men in hunting gear carrying rifles. "No!" Emma tried to shout, but it came out as a whisper. "Don't shoot him." One of the men raised his rifle. What happened next would be debated in Whitefish for years to come. The wolf, who hadn't moved all night, suddenly surged to his feet. The wound on his leg reopened immediately, blood soaking through Emma's careful bandaging. But he stood anyway, positioning himself between Emma and the rifles above. He didn't snarl, didn't bare his teeth, simply stood there, protecting the girl who'd stayed with him through the night. "Don't," Thomas said sharply. "Don't you dare shoot that animal." "Tom, that wolf is dangerous." "That wolf has been feeding my family for 3 weeks," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 40 years as a ranger. "That wolf kept us alive when everyone else abandoned us. You shoot him, you go through me first." The men hesitated. Sarah stared at her father, then at Emma, then at the wolf standing guard. "Get my daughter out of there," Sarah said quietly. Then we figure out what to do about the wolf. Two of the men descended with ropes and climbing gear, moving carefully. The wolf tracked their movements but didn't retreat. When they reached Emma, who was barely conscious from cold, he stepped aside. Only then. Only when he was certain she'd be safe. They carried Emma up the ravine in a sling, wrapped in emergency blankets. At the top, Sarah crushed her
daughter in a hug that was equal parts relief and fury. "Don't you ever," Sarah whispered fiercely, "don't you ever do that again." Emma couldn't respond. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia. Thomas bundled her into his truck, cranked the heat, and drove like the devil was chasing them toward Whitefish Medical Center. Behind them, the three hunters remained at the ravine's edge, staring down at the white wolf. "What do we do about it?" one asked. "Nothing," the oldest one said slowly. "Heard stories about white wolves. My grandfather used to tell them, said they were sacred, said killing one brought 7 years of bad luck. That's superstition. Maybe, but I'm not testing it." He lowered his rifle. "Besides, Tom's right. That animal wasn't aggressive. Could have killed his granddaughter any time during the night. Didn't. That's worth something." They left the ravine, left the wolf standing in the snow, and drove back to town with a story that would grow more elaborate with each telling. Emma woke in a hospital bed 12 hours later. The first thing she saw was her mother's face, haggard with exhaustion and worry. The second was Danny, asleep in a chair, holding her hand. The third was Thomas, standing by the window, staring out at nothing. "The wolf," Emma croaked, her throat raw. "Alive," Thomas said without turning. "I went back this afternoon with a friend from the old ranger days. We got him out of the ravine, transported him to a wildlife rehabilitation center in Kalispell. He's getting proper medical treatment." "Will he live?" "They think so. The wound was infected, but not badly. He's strong, stubborn." Thomas finally looked at her. "Like someone else I know." Sarah sat on the edge of Emma's bed. The hospital social worker came by. "Someone reported our situation. They're sending a caseworker to evaluate whether we're in a safe living situation." Emma's stomach dropped. "They're going to take us away from you, Grandpa." "Maybe, maybe not." Sarah took Emma's hand. "But that's not your problem to solve. You're 12 years old, Emma. You should be worrying about school and friends, not about whether your family is going to survive the winter." "But." "No buts." Sarah's voice was firm, but her eyes were wet. "What you did last night was the bravest and stupidest thing I've ever seen. You could have died, and I'm so angry at you I can barely speak. But I'm also prouder than I have any right to be." Over the next week, everything changed. The story of the white wolf feeding a starving family spread through Whitefish like wildfire. At first, people didn't believe it. Then Thomas showed them the tracks, showed them the pattern of rabbit deliveries, showed them photographs Emma had taken of the wolf from the window. The Whitefish pilot ran the story on page 1. Then the Kalispell paper picked it up. Then regional news. Within 5 days, it had gone viral on social media. The Morrison family, who'd been invisible in their poverty, Suddenly became the center of a story everyone wanted to hear. Donations poured in. A GoFundMe someone set up raised $30,000 in 3 days. The Mountain Pine Lodge, where Sarah cleaned rooms, gave her a promotion and full health benefits. A local church organized a community build to properly winterize Thomas's cabin. But the most unexpected help came from an old woman named Margaret Chen, who owned a 200-acre property bordering Thomas's land. She knocked on the cabin door on New Year's Eve, a tiny woman in her 80s with eyes sharp as broken glass. "I knew your wolf," she said without preamble, "or his ancestor, back in 1974. Thomas stared at her. "What?" "I was a wildlife biologist, back before anyone cared about wolves. I tracked that pack for 3 years. White wolves, we called them. I know what you did, Thomas Morrison. I know you saved that wolf from the trap." "How?" "Because I was the one who reported the illegal trap line. And I was the one who documented the wolf's injury and recovery. I photographed him from a distance, tracked his movements, watched him heal. Margaret's smile was sad. I never said anything because I knew if I did, you'd lose your job. But I've carried that secret for 50 years. Thomas sank into his chair. Why are you telling me now? Because that wolf's descendants just saved your family. Because that kind of loyalty deserves to be honored, not hidden. Margaret pulled out a folder, thick with documents. I've spent the last 50 years building a wildlife corridor on my property. When I die, it's all going to conservation. But I'm 87 years old, and I need someone to manage it. Someone who understands what these mountains mean. Someone who's earned the trust of the wolves. She handed the folder to Thomas. I'm offering you a job. Wildlife Corridor Manager. $40,000 a year, housing included in the caretaker's cabin on my property. It's bigger than this place, properly winterized, close enough to town that your daughter can keep her job, but far enough out that you'll see wolves regularly.
Thomas opened the folder with shaking hands. Why? Because debts go both ways, Mr. Morrison. You saved a wolf 50 years ago. That wolf's family saved yours. Now I'm saving you. Maybe in another 50 years, your granddaughter will save someone else. That's how it works. That's how we survive. Emma, listening from her bed where she was still recovering, felt tears stream down her face. On January 15th, they moved into the caretaker's cabin on the Chen property. It had 3 bedrooms, real insulation, a functioning furnace, and windows that didn't leak cold. Danny's asthma improved within a week. Sarah cut down to 2 jobs, then 1. Emma returned to school for the first time in months, and every night at midnight, at the edge of the tree line, a white shape appeared. The wolf never came close to the new cabin, never left rabbits on the doorstep. He simply stood at the boundary of the property, visible in the moonlight, and watched, making sure they were safe, making sure his debt was paid. Emma would stand at her window and watch him back. Sometimes she'd raise her hand in greeting. Sometimes she swore the wolf nodded in return. "Do you think you'll always come?" she asked Thomas one night. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "Maybe until he's certain we're okay, maybe forever. Wolves form bonds that last lifetimes. I hope he knows we're grateful." "He knows, Em. Trust me, he knows." But on February 14th, Valentine's Day, the wolf didn't appear at midnight. Emma waited until 2 a.m., then 3. By dawn, when the shape still hadn't materialized, she knew something was wrong. Again. This time, when she told Thomas, he was already putting on his coat. They found the wolf 2 miles into the Chen property, in a clearing Emma recognized from her earlier tracking. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a smaller white wolf, a female, with 3 cubs tumbling in the snow nearby. The cubs were maybe 3 months old, barely bigger than house cats, their white fur already showing the same distinctive amber eyes as their father. The male wolf saw Emma and Thomas approach. He stood, positioning himself protectively in front of his family, but he didn't retreat. Emma stopped at the edge of the clearing, understanding flooding through her. "You're not here to watch us anymore," she said quietly. "You're here to introduce us." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he stepped aside. The female wolf chittered nervously but didn't run. The cubs, curious and fearless, the way young things are, tumbled toward Emma with clumsy enthusiasm. Thomas knelt slowly, extending his hand. One of the cubs, braver than his siblings, approached and sniffed carefully. Then, in a gesture that made Emma's heart stop, the cub licked Thomas's fingers. "They're passing it on," Thomas whispered, his voice choked. "The male is teaching his cubs that we're safe, that our family helped his family, and that bond continues." The male wolf chittered softly, calling the cubs back. They bounded to their father, and the family turned to leave, but before disappearing into the trees, the male wolf looked back one last time. Not a goodbye, a promise. Emma raised her hand in farewell. The wolves vanished into the forest, and Emma knew with absolute certainty that she would see them again.
maybe not every night, maybe not for months at a time. But the bond forged 50 years ago, renewed in their darkest winter, would continue. Some debts, Emma realized, weren't debts at all. They were gifts that multiplied across generations, creating webs of loyalty and trust that connected species in ways humans were only beginning to understand. "Come on," Thomas said softly. "Let's go home." They walked back through the winter forest, and behind them, barely visible in the trees, 3 small white shapes followed at a distance, learning the territory, learning the boundaries, learning which family, among all the humans in Montana, was worth protecting. Spring came to Montana with the violence of something held back too long. The snow melted in rushing torrents, turning every creek into a river and every river into a churning brown chaos. The Chen property transformed from white silence into green explosion, wildflowers bursting through mud, aspens leafing out in waves of trembling gold. Emma Morrison turned 13 in March, and with that birthday came changes she hadn't anticipated. She'd grown 3 inches over the winter, shot up so fast her clothes didn't fit anymore. But more than her body had changed, something in her eyes was different now, harder and older. She'd sat with a dying wolf in negative 30-degree cold. She'd watched her family nearly starve. Those experiences left marks that birthdays couldn't erase. School was strange. Her classmates seemed impossibly young, worried about things that felt trivial. Social media drama, who was dating whom, the latest video game release. Emma would sit in class and think about wolf tracks in snow, about the precise moment when starvation becomes real, about the weight of debt carried across 5 decades. "You're different," her best friend Kayla said one day at lunch. Not accusatory, just observing. "Yeah," Emma agreed. "I am." She didn't elaborate. How could she explain what it felt like to be chosen by something wild? To be part of a bond that transcended the normal rules of nature? The white wolves appeared regularly now, though never predictably. Sometimes Emma would see them at dawn, moving through the forest like ghosts. Sometimes at dusk, the 3 cubs playing in the clearing while their parents kept watch. The male wolf, whom Emma had started calling Ghost in her mind, always maintained distance. But his presence was constant, a reassurance that the bond held. Thomas took his new job seriously. Margaret Chen, despite her age, was sharp as ever and had specific ideas about how her property should be managed. Thomas spent his days maintaining the trails, documenting
Wildlife, and working with Margaret to expand the conservation corridor. For the first time in decades, Emma saw her grandfather genuinely happy. He'd found purpose again. Sarah bloomed in ways Emma hadn't thought possible. With stable income and reasonable hours, she'd started taking online classes in hospitality management. The constant exhaustion that had defined her for months faded, replaced by something Emma had almost forgotten: her mother's laugh. Danny, now 5.5, didn't remember the starving times clearly. They'd become dreamlike to him, something that maybe happened to someone else. He played outside now, building elaborate stick forts in the forest, creating entire worlds from pine cones and imagination. Everything should have been perfect. But in April, the trucks arrived. Emma first noticed them on the property adjacent to Margaret's land, the old Hutchinson place that had been abandoned for years. Big trucks, construction equipment, men in hard hats surveying the terrain with instruments and clipboards. "What's going on over there?" she asked Thomas one evening. Her grandfather's expression darkened. Development company bought the Hutchinson property, planning to build luxury cabins. 25 units, they're saying, maybe more. But that's right next to the wildlife corridor. I know. Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. The wolves. Yeah, Thomas said quietly. The wolves. Margaret Chen called an emergency meeting that night. They gathered in her living room, a space filled with decades of wildlife photographs and research papers yellowed with age. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, surrounded by maps of the area. Alpine Development Corporation,
she said without preamble, pointing to a survey map. They purchased the Hutchinson property for $1.2 million, planning to clear-cut 40 acres of old-growth forest to build what they're calling wilderness luxury retreats. Each cabin will be 3,000 square feet, full amenities, marketed to wealthy out-of-state buyers who want to experience Montana without actually experiencing anything uncomfortable. Can they do that? Sarah asked. Legally? Yes. The Hutchinsons own that land outright. They can sell to whomever they want, and the new owners can develop it however they want within county regulations. Which are minimal, Thomas added bitterly.
Margaret nodded. Flathead County has some of the loosest development restrictions in Montana. As long as Alpine follows basic building codes and has proper septic systems, they can build pretty much anything. Emma stared at the map, her mind racing. The Hutchinson property bordered the Chen land on the eastern edge, right where Ghost and his family denned, right where the cubs were learning to hunt, right where the white wolves had lived undisturbed for 50 years. They'll destroy the den site, Emma said. Almost certainly, Margaret agreed. Clear-cutting starts in May. Construction begins in June. By fall, that entire area will be unrecognizable. So what do we do? Sarah asked. Margaret's smile was grim. We fight. The next 3 weeks were a crash course in small-town politics and environmental activism. Margaret, it turned out, had been fighting developers for 40 years and knew exactly how the game was played. They started with public comment at the County Planning Commission meeting. Thomas spoke about wildlife corridor disruption. Margaret presented data on habitat fragmentation. A local biologist, Sarah had contacted, talked about endangered species concerns. Alpine Development Corporation sent a lawyer who smiled with too many teeth and explained that Alpine had followed every legal requirement. They'd conducted environmental assessments. They'd filed all proper paperwork. The development would actually increase local tax revenue and create jobs. What about the wolves? Emma asked during public comment period. The lawyer's smile didn't waver. Wolves are managed by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. They're not currently listed as endangered in this region. If wolves are present, they'll simply relocate to adjacent habitat. That's what wolves do. But there is no adjacent habitat, Emma protested. The Chen property is the only protected corridor for miles. That's not our concern, the lawyer said smoothly. We're building on private property with all necessary permits. The Planning Commission has no legal grounds to deny our application. The Commission approved the development 5-2. Emma left the meeting feeling like she'd been punched. In the truck on the way home, she pressed her face against the window and fought tears. It's not over, Margaret said from the front seat. Her voice carried steel that age hadn't softened. That was round 1. We lost, but the fight isn't finished. What else can we do? We make it expensive. We make it public. We make it uncomfortable. Margaret turned to look at Emma. You asked about the wolves at that meeting. That was good. That was smart. People respond to animals more than they respond to abstract concepts like habitat fragmentation. So we make this about the wolves. How? Margaret's smile was sharp. We tell their story. The Whitefish pilot had already covered the Morrison family's winter survival story back in January. Now Margaret contacted the reporter again, a young woman named Jennifer Watts, who'd been sympathetic to their situation. We need you to do a follow-up, Margaret said during their meeting at a local coffee shop. The white wolf pack that saved the Morrison family is about to lose their home to a luxury development. That's your headline. Jennifer's eyes lit up. Can you prove the wolves are still there? Emma pulled out her phone. She'd been photographing the wolves since February, careful not to get too close, using zoom lenses borrowed from Margaret's extensive wildlife photography equipment. The images showed Ghost and his mate, the 3 cubs growing steadily, the family moving through the forest in patterns that clearly indicated established territory. This is incredible, Jennifer breathed, scrolling through the photos. These are white wolves? Arctic wolf subspecies,
Margaret confirmed. Extremely rare in Montana. There are maybe 3 packs in the entire state. This family represents significant genetic diversity. Are they endangered? Not federally, but they should be. The fact that they're not is a political issue, not a scientific one. Margaret leaned forward. Here's what I'm offering you, Jennifer. Exclusive access to the story. Emma will give you her photographs. Thomas and I will provide historical context about the pack's 50-year presence in this area. You'll get interviews, documentation, everything you need for a feature piece that could run statewide. Jennifer was already pulling out her recording equipment. When can we start? The article ran on Sunday, April 23rd. Front page, above the fold, with Emma's photograph of Ghost standing in a shaft of morning sunlight, his white fur glowing like something from mythology. White Wolf's last stand. Rare pack faces displacement as luxury development threatens Montana wildlife corridor. Jennifer had done her homework. The article detailed the pack's history, the Morrison family's survival story, and the impending threat from alpine development. She'd interviewed wildlife biologists who confirmed the rarity of white wolves in Montana. She'd gotten statements from conservation groups expressing concern. Most importantly, she'd made it personal. The article told the story of Ghost saving the Morrison family, the 50-year bond between the wolves and Thomas's family, the 3 cubs who represented the future of this rare bloodline. It went viral within hours. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by Associated Press. By Tuesday, it was running in newspapers across Montana and into neighboring states. By Wednesday, national news outlets were calling, asking for interviews. Emma found herself sitting in front of cameras, telling the story of the night she'd spent in the ravine with Ghost. Thomas recounted the trap rescue from 1974. Even Danny, coached by Sarah, told his version of the scary, hungry times when the wolf brought food. Public opinion shifted fast. The Alpine Development Corporation's Facebook page was
Flooded with angry comments. Their phone lines lit up with complaints. Wildlife advocacy groups organized protests. A petition to halt the development gathered 50,000 signatures in 5 days. But Alpine didn't back down. They've got too much invested, Margaret explained during another strategy meeting. They've already purchased the land, paid for surveys and permits. They're contractually obligated to their investors. Public pressure won't stop them unless it threatens their bottom line. So we threaten their bottom line, Thomas said. How? Sarah asked. Margaret pulled out another set of documents. We file for a wildlife impact assessment. State law allows concerned citizens to request formal assessments if there's evidence of significant wildlife presence on land scheduled for development. It won't stop the project, but it'll delay it. Months, maybe a year, and delay costs money. Will it work? Emma asked. Maybe, probably not, but it buys time. Margaret's expression was grim. And time is what we need for the wolves to relocate. But you said there's no adjacent habitat. There isn't, which means we have to create it. Margaret unfolded a larger map, showing not just her property, but the entire region. I've been in contact with the Forest Service. There's federal land here. She pointed to an area northwest of her property. That's currently designated as general use. I'm proposing we work with them to designate it as protected wildlife habitat. It's 400 acres, mostly wilderness, perfect for wolf territory. That'll take years, Thomas said. It would normally, but if we can demonstrate active use by an endangered or threatened species, we can fast-track the designation. The wolves aren't endangered, Sarah pointed out. Margaret's smile was sharp. Not yet. But Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks just opened public comment period on updating the state's endangered species list. I've submitted a petition to list Arctic wolf subspecies as threatened. If it gets approved, our white wolves become legally protected, and their habitat becomes protected by extension. Emma felt hope kindle in her chest. You think it'll work? I think it's our best shot, Margaret said.
But we need documentation. We need to prove these wolves actively use both my property and the adjacent federal land. We need movement patterns, den site locations, hunting territories, everything. She looked at Emma. That's where you come in. Over the next month, Emma became a wildlife researcher. Margaret trained her in proper documentation techniques, taught her how to use trail cameras and GPS equipment, showed her how to track movement patterns without disturbing the animals. Emma spent every free hour in the forest. Before school, she'd check trail cameras. After school, she'd document new tracks, photograph scat and marking behavior, note kill sites where the wolves had hunted. Weekends were marathon sessions, sometimes 10 hours in the wilderness, moving carefully through Ghost's territory while maintaining respectful distance. The wolves tolerated her presence with what seemed like amused patience. Ghost would sometimes sit on a ridge and watch her stumble through the underbrush, making no effort to hide. The cubs, now nearly 6 months old and gangly with adolescent growth, occasionally followed her at a distance, curious about the strange human who smelled like their territory. Emma documented everything. Movement patterns showed the pack, using both the Chen property and the adjacent federal land regularly. The den site was technically on Margaret's land, but the wolves' hunting territory extended well into the federal acreage. They were, Margaret explained, demonstrating exactly the kind of habitat use that would support a protection designation. By late May, Emma had compiled 400 photographs, 50 hours of trail camera footage, and detailed maps showing wolf presence across 600 acres. "This is extraordinary work," Margaret said, reviewing Emma's documentation. "Graduate students don't produce this quality of data. You've given us everything we need for the petition." But the day they submitted the documentation to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Alpine Development broke ground on the Hutchinson property. Emma heard the chainsaws from her bedroom. The sound carried through the morning air like screaming, the distinctive roar of heavy equipment tearing into old-growth forest. She ran outside, followed the sound to the eastern boundary of the Chen property. From the ridge, she could see clearly into the Hutchinson land. They were clear-cutting everything. Ancient pines that had stood for 200 years fell like matchsticks. The ground was churned to mud by bulldozers. The forest that had been thick and dark and alive was being transformed into an open wound of stumps and destruction. Emma felt rage rise in her throat, so powerful it choked her. That night, the wolves didn't appear at their usual places. Or the next night. Or the night after that. A week passed with no sign of Ghost or his family. Emma checked trail cameras and found nothing. No tracks, no scat, no evidence of wolf presence
Anywhere on the Chen property. "They've left," she told Thomas, her voice hollow. "Maybe," Thomas said carefully. "Or maybe they're just avoiding the noise and disruption. Once the heavy clearing stops, they might return." But Emma knew better. She'd studied wolf behavior enough to understand. The wolves had left their territory. The bond wasn't strong enough to overcome the destruction of their home. She'd failed them. On June 2nd, Emma skipped school and hiked deep into the federal land northwest of Margaret's property. The area Margaret had identified as potential protected habitat. It was rough country, steep and dense, the kind of place humans rarely visited. Emma pushed through underbrush, following game trails, looking for any sign that the wolves had relocated here. She found elk tracks, deer scat, evidence of black bears, but no wolves. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A wolf howl, distant but clear, coming from deeper in the wilderness. Emma's heart stopped. She knew that howl. She'd heard it 100 times over the winter, standing outside the cabin while Ghost announced his presence to the night. She ran toward the sound, abandoning caution, crashing through brush. A second howl joined the first, then a third. "The cubs," Emma thought. "They're calling." She broke into a meadow and stopped dead. On the far side, partially hidden in tree shadows, Ghost stood with his mate and 3 cubs. They were thinner than Emma remembered, ribs showing through their coats. The mate had a limp. One of the cubs was favoring his right paw. They'd relocated, but the move had cost them. Ghost saw Emma and went still. For a long moment they stared at each other across the meadow. Then Ghost did something Emma had never seen before. He approached. Not all the way. He stopped maybe 30 feet away, close enough that Emma could see his individual whiskers, the slight grey that was starting to show around his muzzle. His amber eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was asking a question. Emma understood it without words. "Can we trust you still? Even here? Even in this new place?" Emma slowly lowered herself to the ground, making herself small, non-threatening. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, you can trust me. I'm sorry they took your home. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. But I'm trying. I'm still trying." Ghost held her gaze for another moment. Then, deliberately, he turned and walked back to his family. The mate chittered nervously. The cubs pressed against their parents, and together, the family disappeared into the dense forest. But before they vanished completely, Ghost looked back once. Not goodbye. Never goodbye. The message was clear. We're still here. The bond holds. Don't give up. Emma sat in the meadow for a long time after they left, tears streaming down her face. When she finally stood and started the long hike back, she felt something solidify inside her. The wolves hadn't abandoned the connection. They'd
just moved to survive. The same way Emma's family had moved from the uninsulated cabin to the Chen property. Survival meant adaptation, but bonds meant commitment. She would find a way to protect them, whatever it took. That evening, Emma burst into Margaret's house with dirt on her clothes and determination in her eyes. "I found them," she said. "They've relocated to the federal land, all 5 of them. They're struggling, but they're there." Margaret looked up from her wheelchair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Then we have them exactly where we need them." "What do you mean?" Margaret pulled up the petition she'd been working on. "The Forest Service designation requires proof of active wildlife use. You just gave us that proof. Now we document them using that federal land consistently for 60 days, and we've got grounds for emergency habitat protection." 60 days. Emma's heart sank. Alpine will have half those cabins built by then. Which is why we're also pursuing legal action. Margaret showed her another document. "I've hired an environmental lawyer. We're filing for an injunction to halt construction, pending the wildlife assessment I mentioned earlier. It won't succeed, probably, but it'll slow them down." "How long? Maybe a month, maybe less? But every day we buy is another day for the federal designation to go through." Emma looked at the maps spread across Margaret's desk, the legal documents, the photographs of Ghost and his family. This wasn't just about wolves anymore. It was about whether wild things had a right to exist when they conflicted with human profit. It was about whether bonds forged across generations meant anything in a world that measured value in dollars. "What do you need me to do?" Emma asked. Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Keep doing what you've been doing. Document everything. And get ready to testify." Testify? The County Planning Commission is holding a public hearing in 2 weeks about the Alpine development. There's been enough public pressure that they're required to allow community input before any additional permits are issued. You're going to tell them about the wolves. And Emma?
Yeah? Don't hold back. Make them understand what's at stake.
The next 2 weeks blurred together. Emma documented the wolves on federal land, compiled evidence of their den relocation, photographed the stress visible in their condition. Thomas and Margaret worked with the environmental lawyer, filing motions and gathering scientific support. Sarah took time off work to help organize community members who opposed the development. The night before the hearing, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what she'd say. How do you make people care about animals they've never seen? How do you explain a bond that defies normal understanding? At midnight, she heard a sound outside her window. A wolf howl, distant but clear. Emma went to the window. On the ridge above the house, barely visible in the moonlight, Ghost stood silhouetted against the sky. He wasn't on Chen property anymore, wasn't supposed to be here. But he'd come back, just for this moment, to remind her. The bond holds. Don't give up. Emma pressed her hand against the cold glass. "I won't," she whispered. "I promise." The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the county courthouse. By 6:30, every seat was full. People stood in the aisles, lined the walls, spilled out into the hallway. Local news cameras set up in the back. National reporters had driven in from as far as Seattle. Alpine Development Corporation brought an army. Their lawyer, a team of consultants, even the CEO had flown in from Denver. They set up at the front table with briefcases and folders and the kind of confidence that comes from winning. Emma sat in the front row, between Thomas and Margaret, her hands shaking. She'd worn her best clothes, a button-up shirt and clean jeans, but suddenly felt impossibly young and out of place. The Planning Commission chairman, a heavy-set man named Douglas Reed, called the meeting to order. "We're here to address community concerns regarding the Alpine Development Corporation's Hutchinson property project," he droned. "Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We ask that you keep statements relevant and respectful." The Alpine lawyer spoke first, smooth, professional, armed with charts and economic projections. The development would create jobs, generate tax revenue, bring tourism. The company had followed every regulation, exceeded every requirement. They were good corporate citizens. Then the opposition got their turn. A local biologist spoke about habitat fragmentation. A Forest Service representative discussed wildlife corridor importance. Thomas testified about the historical presence of the wolf pack. Margaret presented her decades of research. Finally, Douglas Reed called Emma Morrison. Emma stood on legs that felt like water. She walked to the podium, gripped its edges to stop her hands from shaking, and looked out at the sea of faces. "My name is Emma Morrison," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone in the back called, "Louder!" She took a breath and tried again. "My name is Emma Morrison. I'm 13 years old. Last December, my family was starving. My mum worked 3 jobs, but we couldn't afford food. We were living in an uninsulated cabin in negative 20-degree weather, and we were going to die." The room had gone quiet. "A white wolf saved us. He brought us rabbits every single night for 3 weeks, kept us alive when everyone else had given up on us. And I know what you're thinking, that sounds impossible. Wolves don't do that." But he did. Emma pulled out her phone, and the bailiff helped project her photographs onto the screen behind her. "This is Ghost. That's what I call him. He's the great-great-grandson of a wolf my grandfather saved from a trap 50 years ago. His family remembers. They remember kindness. They remember that we helped them once, and they paid it back when we needed it most." She showed the next photograph. Ghost standing guard in the ravine. In January, Ghost fell and got hurt. I stayed with him all night in that ravine to keep him from freezing to death. My mom almost lost me, but I couldn't leave him, because leaving him would have been wrong. You don't abandon family. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Emma kept going, her voice gaining strength. Ghost and his mate had 3 cubs this year. Those cubs are learning to hunt, learning to survive, learning which humans are safe and which aren't. They're learning that the Morrison family will never hurt them, that we can be trusted. Emma showed photographs of the cubs playing. But now they can't learn any of that, because Alpine Development is destroying their home. They've had to relocate to land where the hunting is harder, where they don't know the territory. The mate is injured. One of the cubs is limping. They're starving just like we were starving last winter. She looked directly at the Alpine CEO. "You're killing them slowly. And for what? So rich people can have vacation cabins? So your company can make money? Is that really worth more than a family that's been living in these mountains for 50 years? Emma's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I know I'm just a kid. I know my 3 minutes don't matter as much as your economic projections and your legal permits. But those wolves mattered when I was dying in a ravine. They mattered when my family was starving. and they matter now. She looked at the Planning Commission. My grandfather taught me that when you can help, you must. That's what it means to be human. Well, we can help. We can protect what's left of their habitat. We can designate that federal land as a wildlife corridor. We can slow this development until we found a way to make room for both humans and wolves. Emma's 3 minutes were up, but nobody stopped her. Or we can do what we've always done. Choose money over life. Choose development over preservation. Choose human comfort over every other living thing. And 50 years from now, when the white wolves are extinct and my grandchildren ask me what happened to them, I'll have to say that we knew. We knew they were there. We knew they were dying. And we built luxury cabins anyway. Emma stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. Half the audience stood and applauded. The other half shouted objections. Douglas Reed banged his gavel until the noise died down. "Thank you, Miss Morrison," he said, his expression unreadable. "The Commission will take all testimony under advisement." The hearing continued for another 2 hours, but Emma didn't hear most of it. She sat in her chair, exhausted and shaking, while people she'd never met stopped to tell her she'd been brave, she'd been powerful, she'd said what needed saying. When it finally ended, Douglas Reed announced that the Commission would deliberate and issue a decision within 30 days. 30 days. Emma walked out of the courthouse with Thomas and Margaret into warm June evening air. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple. "You did good, kid," Margaret said quietly. "Real good." "Will it matter?" Emma asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But you made them see the wolves. You made them real. That's more than most people ever manage." They drove home in silence. Emma stared out the window, watching the forest pass by, wondering where Ghost and his family were right now, wondering if her words had been enough. That night, unable to sleep again, Emma walked out onto the porch. The stars were brilliant, infinite, indifferent to human concerns. A shape moved at the edge of the property. Emma's breath caught. Ghost stood there, just barely visible in the starlight. He'd come back again, crossed miles of territory, risked proximity to humans, just to let her know.
I'm still here. We're still here. The fight continues.
Emma raised her hand in greeting, and she could have sworn the wolf dipped his head in acknowledgement. Then he was gone, melting back into the darkness, but the message remained. Some bonds survive everything, even loss, even distance, even the impossible odds of a 13-year-old girl trying to stop a multi-million-dollar corporation. Emma went back inside, and for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. Tomorrow, whatever came, she would face it, because that's what family did. And Ghost and his pack were family now, as surely as Thomas and Sarah and Danny, connected by debt and gratitude and something deeper than either, connected by loyalty that transcended species. The bond would hold. It had to. The 30 days felt like 30 years. Emma went through the motions of normal life. School, homework, helping around the house, but her mind was always in the forest, with the wolves. Every morning, she checked her trail cameras on the federal land. Ghost and his family were still there, still struggling, but surviving. The cubs had grown stronger. The mate's limp had improved. They were adapting. But adaptation wasn't the same as thriving. Alpine development worked around the clock. By mid-July, they'd cleared 60 acres and poured foundations for 8 cabins. The sound of construction echoed through the valley from dawn to dusk, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Thomas grew quieter. Margaret spent long hours on the phone with lawyers and wildlife officials. Sarah watched Emma with worried eyes, seeing how much her daughter had invested in an outcome she couldn't control. On July 17th, exactly 30 days after the hearing, Douglas Reed called a special session of the Planning Commission. The courthouse was packed again. Emma sat between Thomas and Margaret, her stomach twisted in knots, so tight she could barely breathe. The Alpine contingent sat across the aisle, confident and relaxed. Reed gavelled the meeting to order,
and shuffled papers with bureaucratic precision. The Commission has reviewed all testimony and evidence regarding the Alpine Development Corporation's Hutchinson property project, he began. We've consulted with county legal counsel, received input from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and carefully considered the economic and environmental impacts. Emma gripped the armrests of her chair. The Commission's decision is as follows. We find that Alpine Development Corporation has complied with all necessary regulations and permits. However, given the significant public concern regarding wildlife impact, we are requiring Alpine to fund an independent environmental assessment before any additional construction permits are issued. Emma's heart sank. That wasn't enough. An assessment would delay construction by weeks, maybe a couple months at most. It wouldn't stop anything. Reed continued. Furthermore, we are recommending that the Forest Service expedite their
review of the proposed wildlife corridor designation on adjacent federal land. While we cannot mandate federal action, we believe the evidence presented by Margaret Chen and Emma Morrison warrants serious consideration. It was something, but not enough. The Alpine lawyer stood, barely suppressing a smile. The Commission's decision is acceptable to Alpine Development Corporation. We'll comply with the environmental assessment and continue construction on completed permits. Reed banged his gavel. This session is adjourned. People began filing out, some satisfied, most disappointed. Emma sat frozen in her chair. It's not enough, she whispered. Margaret placed a weathered hand on Emma's shoulder. No, it's not. But the fight isn't over. That night, Emma couldn't eat. She sat on the porch, staring into the darkness, feeling like she'd failed everyone. Failed Ghost, failed his family, failed the promise she'd made. At midnight, she heard the howl. Not Ghost's usual announcement. This was different, urgent, distressed. Emma was on her feet instantly. "Thomas, something's wrong." Her grandfather emerged from the house, already pulling on boots. They grabbed flashlights and ran toward the sound, Sarah calling after them to be careful. The howling came from the eastern boundary, near where the Alpine construction had stopped for the night. Emma and Thomas crashed through underbrush, following the desperate calls. They found one of the cubs. The young wolf, maybe 8 months old now, was caught in a tangle of construction debris, wire fencing and lumber scraps that had been carelessly dumped at the forest edge. The cub had wandered too close, probably investigating the strange new smells, and gotten his hind leg tangled in wire loops. He was panicking, thrashing, making the wire cut deeper with every movement. 30 feet away, Ghost and his mate stood watch. They could have attacked Emma and Thomas. Should have, by all instincts, when humans approached their trapped offspring. But Ghost held his ground, not aggressive, just watching, waiting, trusting. "Easy," Thomas said quietly, approaching the cub with slow movements. "We're here to help, little one, just like I helped your great-great-grandfather." Emma pulled wire cutters from her pocket. She'd started carrying them everywhere after Ghost's trap incident. Together, they worked carefully, cutting away the wire while Thomas held the cub still. The young wolf struggled at first, then seemed to understand, went still, let them work. 5 minutes later, the cub was free. His leg was cut, but not badly. Thomas wrapped it quickly with bandages from their emergency kit. "There," Thomas said softly. "You're okay now." The cub limped toward his parents. Ghost approached, sniffed his son carefully, then turned back to Emma and Thomas. What happened next, Emma would remember for the rest of her life. Ghost walked forward until he was less than 10 feet away. Then, deliberately, he lowered his head and made a sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a chitter. Something that carried meaning beyond words. "Thank you." Again. Still. Then the alpha wolf did something Emma had never seen any wolf do. He lay down, made himself vulnerable, and in that vulnerability made a statement more powerful than any aggression could have been. We are bound, your family and mine, across generations, forever. Emma dropped to her knees, tears streaming. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them from taking your home. I tried. I swear I tried. Ghost held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, gathered his family, and disappeared into the forest. But as they vanished, Emma heard something that made her heart stop. More howls, multiple voices, coming from different directions. Thomas, she breathed. How many wolves are howling? Her grandfather stood very still, listening. More than 5, more than 10 even. They ran toward the main howling, which came from the meadow on federal land where Emma had first found the relocated pack. They burst into the clearing and stopped, dead. Wolves, at least 20 of them, maybe more, spread across the meadow in the moonlight. Grey wolves, black wolves, and there, impossibly, 2 more white wolves, smaller than Ghost but unmistakably the same bloodline. Ghost stood at the center, and as Emma watched, the other wolves approached him one by one, touching noses, lowering heads, submitting to his leadership.
He's called a gathering, Thomas whispered in awe. I've read about this, but never thought I'd see it. When an alpha faces a threat too large for his pack alone, he can call for help. Other packs, other families, they come if the cause is worthy. But why? Emma asked. What can they do? As if in answer, the wolves began to howl in unison. The sound rolled across the valley, echoing off mountains, carrying for miles. Not random howling. This was coordinated, purposeful. A claim. This land is ours. We are many. We will not leave quietly. The howling continued for 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. Emma stood transfixed, watching this impossible gathering, understanding that she was witnessing something rare, something that might never happen again in her lifetime. When the howling finally stopped, the wolves dispersed, but they didn't leave the area. Emma saw them spreading out across the federal land, marking territory, establishing presence, making it clear that this wasn't just Ghost's pack anymore. This was a coalition. News of the wolf gathering spread through Whitefish like wildfire. Hikers reported seeing wolves everywhere on the federal land adjacent to the Alpine development. Trail cameras captured dozens of animals. Wildlife biologists from the University of Montana drove down to document the unprecedented behavior. This changes everything, Margaret said at an emergency meeting 3 days later. Her eyes gleamed with triumph. The Forest Service can't ignore this. We're not talking about one small pack anymore. We're talking about a significant wolf population actively using federal land. That's exactly the justification they need for emergency habitat protection. She was right. Within a week, the Forest Service announced a temporary halt to any private development within 1 mile of the newly designated Whitefish Wolf Corridor, pending formal habitat assessment. Alpine Development sued immediately, but their lawsuit was delayed when Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks announced they were upgrading the status of Arctic wolf subspecies in Montana to threatened based on genetic diversity concerns, which meant Ghost's white wolves were now legally protected, and their habitat was protected by extension. The legal battle dragged on for months, but without permits to continue construction, Alpine's timeline collapsed. Their investors grew nervous. By October, the company was hemorrhaging money from legal fees and delayed projects. In November, they offered a settlement. They would sell the remaining undeveloped portion of the Hutchinson property to a conservation trust for 2/3 of their purchase price. The 8 cabins already built could be completed and sold, but the remaining 40 acres would be added to Margaret's wildlife corridor. It wasn't perfect. Emma knew that. 8 luxury cabins where forest had stood. 8 pieces of wilderness transformed into human convenience. But 40 acres saved. Ghost's original den site preserved. The corridor maintained. Margaret signed the agreement. Sometimes victory isn't getting everything you want, it's getting enough to make a difference. On December 19th, 2024, exactly 1 year after the first rabbit appeared on the Morrison doorstep,
Emma hiked out to the meadow on federal land. Snow was falling, gentle and steady, covering the world in white. Emma sat on a fallen log and waited. At noon, they came. Ghost appeared first, older now, moving with the careful dignity of a wolf in his prime. His mate followed, and behind them, 3 adolescent cubs, nearly as large as their parents. But they weren't alone. The 2 other white wolves Emma had seen at the gathering emerged from the trees, and with them, 4 tiny cubs, maybe 3 months old, tumbling through snow too deep for their short legs. Ghost's extended family, his bloodline continuing. The alpha approached Emma, closer than he'd ever come before, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, close enough to see grey threading through his muzzle, the slight stiffness in his gait that spoke of age catching up. They looked at each other, girl and wolf, and Emma understood what he was showing her. The bond had expanded. What began with Thomas and one trapped wolf had grown into something larger, a connection between species that would outlast both of them. "Thank you," Emma whispered, "for everything, for saving us, for trusting us, for teaching me what loyalty really means." Ghost held her gaze for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost deliberate, he turned and let the 4 tiny cubs approach Emma. They came fearlessly, tumbling over each other, sniffing her boots with tiny noses. One of them, braver than the rest, sat on her foot and looked up at her with amber eyes exactly like Ghost's. Emma felt tears freeze on her cheeks. This was Ghost's message. This was what he'd come to show her. The next generation, the future, the promise that some bonds don't end with one lifetime, but echo forward into forever. The cubs played for a few minutes more, then their parents called them back. The extended family gathered together, white and grey shapes against white snow, and Emma took one last photograph. Then they were gone, disappearing into the forest that would remain theirs for at least one more generation. Emma walked home through falling snow, her heart full of something that felt like hope. 23 years later, December 19th, 2047, Whitefish, Montana. Dr. Emma Morrison Chen, director of the Morrison Wildlife Research Station, stood at her office window and watched her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, play in the snow outside. The research station had been built on Margaret Chen's property 5 years after the old woman's death, funded by an endowment Margaret had secretly established. Emma's phone buzzed, a text from the research station's trail cameras. Motion detected, Sector 7, multiple large animals. Emma pulled up the live feed and her breath caught. A massive white wolf stood at the forest edge, watching the research station. But this wolf was too young to be Ghost, who died peacefully 8 years ago at the extraordinary age of 16. This had to be one of Ghost's great-grandchildren, carrying the same distinctive white coat, the same amber eyes. And behind him, 3 cubs. Emma watched as Lily noticed the wolves. Her daughter moved toward them slowly, fearlessly, exactly as Emma had done at her age. The wolf didn't retreat, didn't show aggression. It sat down and waited, as if it had been expecting this moment. Emma grabbed her coat and ran outside. "Lily, stop!" But Lily had already reached the wolf's position. She stood 10 feet away, staring up at the magnificent animal with wonder. The wolf stared back. Then, deliberately, it lowered its head. The same gesture Ghost had made to Emma all those years ago. The bond continues. The debt passes forward. Your daughter is recognized. Emma reached Lily's side, and that's when she saw it. The wolf's right shoulder bore a distinctive scar, the same scar Ghost had carried. The same scar Ghost's ancestor had carried from Thomas's trap rescue in 1974. But that was impossible. Scars weren't genetic. They couldn't be passed down through bloodlines. Unless... Emma looked closer. Not a scar, a marking, a pattern in the white fur that looked exactly like scar tissue, but was actually a genetic mutation. A bloodline marker that said, "We are the descendants of the wolf who was saved."
We remember. We keep our promises. The wolf had been showing them all along. This wasn't just learned behavior passed through pack knowledge. This was something deeper. Evolution itself responding to bond and loyalty, marking the bloodline of wolves who'd learned that humans could be trusted. The white wolf stood, gathered its cubs, and before vanishing into the forest, it did something Emma would never forget. It looked directly at her daughter and made a sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a howl. Then it glanced at Emma with what could only be described as expectation. Your turn is ending. Hers is beginning. Lily turned to her mother, eyes shining. "Mama, why did the wolf look at me like that?" Emma knelt beside her daughter, remembering another winter, another wolf, another impossible bond forming. "Because," she said softly, "your great-great-grandfather saved his great-great-great-grandfather, and some debts take generations to fully repay. Some bonds never end, they just transform and continue." "Will the wolf come back?" Lily asked. Emma looked at the tree line where the white shape had vanished, then at the research station that stood where Margaret Chen's cabin once did, then at the vast wilderness that now bore her family's name for the conservation efforts that had started with one 13-year-old girl who refused to give up. "Yes," Emma said, "when you need him most. That's what family does." And somewhere in the distance, a wolf
Howled. Not a warning, not a threat, but a promise echoing across decades and generations. The bond holds. The story continues. The wolves remember everything.